recent advert for the New York Times bureau chief in Nairobi caused a little uproar for relying on tired old stereotypes of the region and of Africa in general. How is it possible to put these old images in the past? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. War, terrorism, piracy, the way the New York Times tried to sell East Africa to potential candidates was widely derided. But if one of the world's biggest newspapers is guilty of relying on cliches, how is it possible ever to escape them?
What comes to mind when a person thinks of Africa? Often it's images of war, poverty, disease, or animals in the wild. They've developed into stereotypes, widely reflected in the media. A study on US television found 60% of news on Africa was about conflicts, terrorism, and disease. Critics have pointed to a knowledge gap about Africa and so-called white saviour tendencies in mainstream Western news, as shown in this recent job advert for the New York Times Nairobi bureau chief. Dive into news from the deserts of Sudan and the pirate seas of the Horn of Africa down through the forests of Congo, with many vital storylines including terrorism and the scramble for resources. Even US President Donald Trump has reinforced the stereotypes, famously referring to failed African countries with an offensive term. Africa is a continent rich in resources and cultures, so why does the Western media continue to focus on the cliches?
Great to say that joining us on the line from Canterbury, we have Hakim, historian of Africa from the University of Chichester, with me at the round table. Wana, Udobang, who's a journalist. Onyekachi, Wambu, executive director of African Foundation for Development, who works to, in quotes, enhance the contributions Africans in the diaspora make to African development. And Arvy, Nahar, oil and gas energy specialist working in Africa. Great to have you all with us. Hakim, let me come to you first of all. What damage do you think these stereotypes do?
One problem is that they prevent us having an accurate understanding of the world. They present a distorted, a false view of things. And of course, we as citizens living in the 21st century want to understand the world the way that it is. The other problem with these stereotypes about Africa and Africans is that they also have an influence on, or an impact on, Africans in the diaspora. So the way that people perceive Africans in Britain or in Europe or in the US and so on. So I think that those are two of the major problems. The other is that they continue what we can call racist, Eurocentric views about Africa. And of course, at the moment, racism and Eurocentrism is a massive problem in the world.
Okay, let's bring it back to the table here, because to war, terrorism, disease, you could also add as tired old cliches, lazy, corrupt. What damage specifically to Africa, do you think this is doing?
I think it definitely causes an issue with how it is we also try to understand ourselves, because we tend to start seeing ourselves through that lens as well. Because it isn't only the outside world that's being fed that, but you actually fed that within you, because this sort of image is being projected on you constantly as well. And yeah, so I think a lot of people find themselves in spaces where they're constantly trying to fight stereotype. You're working and navigating through life trying to defy stereotypes, essentially.
You're a journalist,
yeah.
As am I, and have been for a long time. And we know that, okay, cliches aren't necessarily the things you should use, but they are there because they actually do paint a relatively accurate picture to some extent. And what we're seeing here, perhaps, is actually a reflection of what Africa as a continent, and we'll get into that because it's so many different countries, what Africa actually is. There is a lot of war. There is an element of terrorism. There is disease, et cetera, et cetera. So how can you airbrush that away? Well, okay.
I think stereotypes are about sending a short message. And you said an accurate message, not necessarily so. You know, there's a stereotype behind us here with the Maasai warrior. And, you know, we're trying to convey a very quick
Okay,
image.
what would you put up there? Picture of a skyscraper?
No, I'm just saying, I'm not challenging.
No, and I'm
not
asking what the alternative is. If this
I'm
is
saying
not
that-
the reality.
I'm saying that each of those stereotypes is trying to send a quick message to an audience about this is what Africa is. But I'm saying it's not necessarily accurate. I mean, the Maasai warrior, we all understand that it conveys something about Africanness, but it's not the total story.
No, but you would say this is Africa if you looked at it, rather than looking at a picture of a skyscraper, just as you would say if you saw a kangaroo, Australia. Yeah, rather than a picture of government buildings in Canberra.
Yeah.
It's shorthand, if you like, isn't it? But it's not inaccurate.
It is, but it's also, you know, just to, in hindsight, we have to be very, very careful, especially in the business world, how we portray Africa as well. I think corporations definitely have a duty of care to ensure that the region, you know, is relayed in the most positive manner. And I agree, this picture, okay, you're right, it does state Africa and it is Africa. However, what about the huge skyscrapers that are going up in Lagos right now? What about the entrepreneurs making headway at ports? You know, let's talk about it being the final frontier. Let's talk about, you know, it is the new business hub of the world.
Would you say that it is portrayed for any reason other than laziness on the part of journalists and others, communicators? It is portrayed as the last continent to be modernised for any other reason than that people are being lazy in their description?
But even that is highly discriminatory, you know, to be modernised. You know, in what way would you like to be modernised? You know, everybody has their own definition of what you regard as being modern. You know, one cannot...
Developed.
Correct. I prefer that word because, yes, you know, there are also other parts of the world that are
we have to be careful in our business about what words we choose. You're absolutely right. Okay.
And I think that we, you know, we all have a responsibility to portray that positive image about Africa in the media.
Okay, I'll go into some facts and figures
Sure.
about headlines and corruption in just a moment, if I may. But Hakim, I want to come back to you because you've started something called the Young Historians. You are a historian yourself. And so what are you trying to do in conveying to younger people what the history of Africa means today?
Well, the Young Historians project was started because young people of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain are not engaging with history. And one of the reasons for that is that they're presented a very Eurocentric view of history at school or at university and so on. And so amongst young people, history has become a very unpopular subject. So what we're trying to do is to enable young people to investigate, study history for themselves, particularly the history of Africans or people of African heritage in Britain. So at the moment, for example, they're engaged in a project looking at the history of African women in Britain between 1930 and 2000. Because this is a history which you can't find anywhere. Although there have been Africans here for at least 2,000 years, this is a picture of Britain that's not being presented.
So you're trying to update the image of Africa in the eyes of young people. Onyekachi, with your Africa Foundation? What's that about?
Well, we work with the diasporas here to contribute to Africa. And the point that was made earlier is that a lot of the young Africans who are born here that we work with have internalized a lot of these negative images and sometimes see Africa in those kind of problematic ways. The big point that I wanted to make was that the image of Africa or how Africa is seen is, you know, we see it now to forward as a formula. And on one side of the formula is how other people see Africa. And then on the other side of the equation is how Africans themselves project themselves. And what we have seen is that there isn't enough of different stories, as the novelist Chimamanda said about the danger of a single story, different stories being projected by Africans themselves. We're not here discussing the American stereotype because the Americans can defend their own image. We're here discussing the African one because I think sometimes we don't do enough, we don't invest enough in being able to project all the different stories that are there.
There's an element here of it being an impossible task because Africa is not a country. I've heard that so many times. Africa is 50 plus countries. Africa is a continent. You cannot change the image of a continent because it is not a homogenized entity.
The question is really who has the power to represent or to present Africa. And often the case is that it's the big media outlets, the major politicians who make stereotypical comments about Africa and Africans. And this is what is presented in the news, this is what is presented in the media, and that is what we have to deal with, and that undoubtedly has an impact on Africa and Africans generally, particularly young people.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there for just a moment because I know Wanu wanted to say something. We've got to move it around a bit, Hakim. Come back to you shortly. Yeah.
I think one of the things is stereotypes are not the full story, and I think that's one of the bigger issues, essentially. I'm not necessarily about the whitewashing of a continent and saying, oh, you know, just trying to project certain images, but I think it's about telling layered stories and affording or giving people the same complexities that you give everybody else in the world.
As a journalist, I think I'm right in saying that you get a little bit fed up with being asked to write about the things that you don't think are necessarily the most important things.
Absolutely, and in
You're
fact,
asked to write about famine, Boko Haram, etc., etc.
Absolutely, yeah? I'm also sometimes even when I want to write a story, when I pitch a story about, you know, an artist or a beauty trend, it has to have some kind of underpinning. So I can't just write.
By which you mean what?
So I can't just write about, say, a beauty trend, say, you know, women in northern Nigeria have the sugar waxing treatment called, you know, halawa, and it just be about that. It has to be about these people who are, you know, child brides, and then they're now empowering themselves through this beauty, you know, this centuries of beauty trend, you know, whatever it is.
You're saying that's untrue, or is that an element of it?
I don't think that it's necessarily relevant. I think that a beauty trend in itself is important enough. It can stand on its own.
But a beauty trend to oppressed young people is perhaps more difficult to attain than a beauty trend in other countries. So I see both sides of this one. But I want to put this to you, each and every one of you. Every day I subscribe to a thing called Africa 10 News, which is the top 10 stories coming out of Africa. Here's today's, 4 of them. Officials implicated in Ghana's deforestation. Problems for South Africa, New Dawn pile-ups. Senegal appears in the bad books, plastic pollution. And then we get what makes Kenya's beaches among the very best, and you think, fantastic. Yes, I've been there. I mean, I love those beaches, until you start to think, hang on, Lamu, northern Kenya, go to the beaches, Al-Shabaab, you know, and there's 2019 as well, although there were the big attacks in 2014. It's impossible to ignore what is happening in some places. And that's what we're being asked to do if we push the old image away, aren't we?
Well, I mean, equally, you know, when we were having the spate of terrorism attacks across Europe and you wanted to visit Paris or London, would that be a big factor in you wanting to come to London or Paris?
I would guess it might be, yeah.
Well, but I don't think people.
I don't think that's what it's.
Yeah, people were making those calculations. I mean, they worked out that, you know, the security services would probably be able to deal with it, and if you got caught up. Yeah.
UK government advice: terrorists are very. This is today likely to carry out attacks in Kenya, Nairobi, and then you get down to the coast, Mombasa and Malindi. It's the reality. It's difficult to change the reality, is what I'm saying.
But you see, again, I would question, you know, social media outlets and the media have such a significant role to play here. You know, again, why is it that when we discuss Africa as a continent, you know, the first thing we want to hear about is the negativity?
But you're asking for an advertorial, if you like, a paid-for editorial.
But we are, and I understand that. But I also think we, as, you know, I think where each of us is responsible for portraying a very positive image. You know, I get it. I go onto Google Images. If you put something in, for example, if I put in Senegal, and the first thing that comes up is the recent outcry of an oil company and fraud and how not to do business in country, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and
I'm not going to dwell on the negativity, you know, but because we'll get on to how we can change this in just a moment. But Onyekachi, I noticed in my producer's notes you said that corruption's actually getting a great deal better. But if you look at the Transparency International report, it's not. It's actually going the other way.
In which countries? As you
All right,
say,
I've got a list here.
there are
Somalia,
multiple-
South Sudan.
multiple countries.
Sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest scoring region in the world, followed closely by Eastern Europe and
Yeah,
Central
but-
Asia.
but
Okay,
the-
Cote
but-
d'Ivoire and Senegal
then
have
the
got better.
discourse-
Burundi, Congo, Mozambique, Liberia, and Ghana.
But then the discourse
worse.
doesn't include the fact that most of the corrupt money is in the West. It is sitting in offshore accounts in Cayman or London or Switzerland. I mean, when you tackle African corruption, it exists in some pristine Africanness, and it's not connected to a broader international, story, which is that actually this money, there is collusion going on in the West. And when you talk about the City of London, you don't immediately talk about corruption. But Abacha stashed, $4 billion here, and Nigeria's been fighting to get that back. So the discourse has to be more complex.
Yes.
Like
Okay.
more
Okay.
nuanced,
So
more
let us
robust.
now move on from this. I've laid out some facts and figures. I've put some perceptions to each and every one of you, and you have, quite rightly, because you feel that you ought to do that, and knocked me back a little bit on this. I totally understand that. Now come to me and sell your continent. Arvy, first of all, tell me why Africa is so
Because it's
brilliant and why everybody else has got it wrong.
Because it is the next final frontier, okay? It's the next giant trading hub, business hub of the world. So we can't ignore business development in country. And that's just not Western companies entering the region. That's also local companies.
You've said Africa is thriving. This is a quote I've
Absolutely.
got here. But are
Absolutely.
Africans?
Yes, they are. And this is part of the point that I wanted to discuss. Not enough airtime is given to the entrepreneurs and the greatness of the continent. There's huge business development going on in country, but I don't see it on mainstream
Would you
media.
say the difference between the richest and the poorest in Africa has increased?
I think there's an up and coming middle class because business is thriving, and business development is, local content development is
Okay, great
increasing.
place to go and do business. Hakim, what do you think? Africa is thriving?
I think Africans are thriving, sometimes in difficult circumstances. But Africa is the world's second largest continent with a population of millions. Why
1.2
do
billion,
we
I
want to
think.
talk about it in a superficial way? That the whole point is that Africa is inhabited by lots of different human beings, the vast majority of them wonderful people, going about their lives, developing their families, just as people in any other continent, just as people in Britain. The issue is, why should it be presented in a negative way? Or why should Africa be presented in a negative way?
Okay, so
That's
really
not
what
to
we're
say
getting
that
round
it's
to is it
not
needs to be more nuanced. We need to be careful about what we say in generalialities.
Absolutely, and I think Africa doesn't need to be sold to anyone. It's a place it's a continent like
Well, it's
anywhere
pretty much
else.
been sold to China, hasn't it?
I think it's a continent like anywhere else, like Europe, like America. So I don't think that anything needs to be sold in the way that it's out there. I think the stories need to be, as we have said already, the stories need to be complicated. The stories need to reflect.
Yeah.
its
So
own-
this is not about sort of making Africa and Africans more prosperous necessarily. It's about treat Africa with respect.
Exactly. Like anybody else and like anywhere else.
And you believe, I think, Onyekachi, that it's up to Africa to set an example. Very difficult when it's 50 plus countries. But in the same way that India has taken itself forward, in the same way that China has taken itself forward, what lessons can we learn from those two examples?
Well, I think, as Hakim said, there are 1 billion plus Africans, 1 billion plus stories. We need to hear more of that. We need to create platforms where those stories can be expressed. It's about investing in those platforms. China, India, even Turkey have invested in platforms where they can project their view of the world. They can project their sense of what their priorities are, and Africans need to do the same.
We come back to this whole business of Turkey can do that, China can do it because they are single entities.
Yeah, but-
India can do it, but Africa is not a single entity.
Yeah, but
so I'm wondering if it's possible.
No, but there's some very big economies in Africa relative to the others. Nigeria, South Africa are big players, and Nigeria, for instance, is not punching to its weight in terms of what it could be doing to reverse and project a different kind of African reality, and that is about and that's about investment.
I don't know. I suppose we could go around in circles.
No, I'm saying
the pollution in the Niger Delta.
No, I'm saying multiple voices. So that there's Nigeria,
that's the reality as well.
Yeah, of course, and nobody wants to not deal with that. But at the same time, Nigerian music and the young creatives and films are now global phenomena. Why can't we talk about that as well?
But what about the Timbuktu Music Festival?
Yes, I mean, there's
I think it's been disrupted. It's brilliant, but it's been disrupted.
There's art. There's art. There's
conflict.
There's business and enterprise.
Yeah.
So there's a whole load of things that we can cover on these platforms.
Hakim, quickly.
You keep mentioning conflict, but you don't explain how this conflict or why this conflict occurs. The conflicts in Africa aren't just because Africans like having conflicts. Those conflicts are usually caused by foreign intervention. Libya would be an obvious example. Congo would be another example. These are caused by people outside of the African continent interfering in Africa. So I think every time you speak about conflict, you need to mention those countries which are causing the conflict.
Okay, but I mean, in terms of Timbuktu, which I happen to mention, there you have two influences that come to mind. One is Boko Haram, which is perhaps influenced from outside, but is intrinsically local to that part of Africa. And you also have Al-Qaeda in the Sahel.
Exactly, and you need to explain the origin of what you call Al-Qaeda in the Sahel. And you need to explain the impetus that it was given by NATO's invasion of Libya and so on and so forth. We can go into these things and they can be explained.
Yeah, again, we come back to nuanced. But I'm wondering, therefore, this is where...
No, it's not nuanced. You are presenting something which is inaccurate about Africa. You are presenting a view that conflict is inherent in Africa without explaining that outside intervention has caused these conflicts or exacerbated conflicts.
Okay.
And that's the problem with stereotypes and Eurocentric approaches to things.
I think I completely agree with everything that he said. Looking at, I think, not presenting a fuller picture, essentially. So it's not just about mentioning conflict, but all the other issues underpinning different issues.
As a journalist, you will pitch stories pretty much every day because you need to get a paycheck at the end of the month, and if they print your stories, you'll get it. Yeah. Tell me 3 or 4 of the stories that you've got in mind at the moment, and which ones you think are most likely to make print or TV.
I mean, I can't think of. I'm working on a story at the moment.
You don't want to give the idea away, is that it?
No, well. I mean, I can't think of all these things on top of my head instantly because I'm working on numerous things. But
are they all good news stories?
There's some of them that might be, issue-based stories. There's some of the stories that are not, that are just, about artists or culture or, different kinds of things like that. I think one of the issues I know I faced whenever I'm pitching stories is, as I did say earlier, is how everything has to be underpinned by a problem or by an issue, which I feel that a lot of the time with my fellow journalists, other parts of the world, don't necessarily have to deal with that. They could actually write a story about something, as I said, about a beauty trend, about an artist, about a cultural experience, and just write a story.
As we come to the end of this program, and Hakim, I hope you understand, I'm just putting this out there as the way that other people have put it out there, not necessarily my own views. But Arvy, let me ask you, when it comes to selling the continent as such, what would be the very first thing you would say?
I think
to get over these obstacles.
Yeah, you see, again, I don't really like that word selling. We're not here to sell anything or anyone. I think it's about a very clear approach and the message Africa has to bring to the world. It's a, example of that now is the African Free Trade Agreement. That shows you that there's leaps being made in development with all African countries involved. So again, it's not about selling it. I think it's about understanding that it's a very complex part of the world, But again, harnessing all of that, business can be done. And I'm very enthusiastic about promoting local content in country.
Listen, do appreciate the fact that you've all come onto the programme. And yes, okay, I've been told off a number of times. I quite, Onyekachi, quickly.
It was just about the complex stories, and you asked about which stories would one put across. There is a stereotype that Africa has been held up by aid agencies and everything else. And we appreciate the money that comes in from aid, but actually the biggest aid donors to Africa are other Africans who live outside, the ones that I'm trying to mobilize to do more. And last year, they sent about $87 billion through formal channels. So it's likely to be much more than that, but $87 billion to Africa. And that's a story that, again, is not being covered. And they were the biggest aid donors into Africa.
Well, I hope the message gets out to those who would like to hear it from us here, $87 billion. Onyekachi, thank you. Wanu, appreciate it. Arvy, great to have you on the programme. And Hakim, I understand what you were saying. Appreciate your time once again on Roundtable.
Forward.
As for the African Free Trade Agreement, we talked about it last week here on Roundtable. So tune in and you'll find out the very latest on all the things that matter around the world. I'm David Foster from me and my team. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.